Hello, everybody, and welcome to Queer Talk. Queer Talk is a podcast by Fighting Fear. Fighting Fear is a community for queer people by queer people. You can find out more about us on our website, www.fightingfear.co.uk, and on our social media handles on all the major accounts, including Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and LinkedIn, Fighting Fear Community. So today we have a very special guest. I'm sure many of you recognize him in the screen right now, but I will let him introduce himself.
It's good to be with you. I don't know. When I introduce myself, usually I tend to keep it simple and keep it human rather than professionally based. I am someone who's worked for about 20 years as a journalist. I'm Ahmed originally from Palestine, but I've lived kind of all over the world. And yeah, I like to believe or think of myself rather as a storyteller who experiments with different modalities. I've obviously come to be known more publicly. Oh, sorry. I think that was my reminder that we're having this conversation. So I'm also ADHD, which that's another identifier. But yeah, I like to think of myself as a storyteller. Because I'm also, exploring film more and more, both as an actor and as a producer, even though publicly people have, maybe if people know me, they think they know me more as a journalist.
Thank you so much, Ahmed. It's such an honor and pleasure to have you on this episode of Queer Talk. So, as you rightly said, I think a lot of people will recognize you automatically from your journalism, specifically with your journalism in terms of the Palestinian cause, and even more so recently with the war on Gaza.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, obviously, this is something you've been covering for many years now, but I think you've become a household name over the last 15 months. So, with that. So you've been covering Gaza now for from the very beginning, even before the genocide began. What are some of the realities on the ground that legacy media, in your opinion, refuses to show the world?
Oh, that's a really sort of
Going in, I'm going
broad.
to the big ones.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's also a broad question, and I want to give it the justice it deserves. That said, I mean, the first thought that comes to mind, and I think it's always good to start with your instincts, is almost everything. I think it's really hard to overstate the way in which both the mainstream media and just the sort of media establishment and political establishment, because I think there's a lot of collusion there, particularly on this topic. I think they've not only failed, I think it's been a deliberate failure to keep the public informed, which one could argue is, one of the more basic sort of core tenets. Sorry, that was another reminder. I think it was one of the core tenets, right, of journalism in any society, not just to keep the public informed, but more specifically to hold the powerful to account. So I think one of the biggest failures of, let's call it legacy media, is its refusal to report about Palestinians in the same way that it does Israelis. Its refusal to acknowledge something very basic, a truth that is undeniable, which is that Palestinians are human, just like Israelis are human, and that they deserve equal rights. And, what's so troubling about that to me, and I know you're maybe asking and hoping for more specifics in my answer, but I think it's important to be broad because, so much of Israeli propaganda, the propaganda that we've seen over decades, the dehumanizing propaganda, is designed, is manufactured, is engineered, is funded and coordinated in the West to manufacture consent for ethnic cleansing and genocide. So the coverage, as I'm sure you know, Saqib, often reduces Palestinians to statistics, to death tolls, to casualty counts, rather than individual lives, families, and stories. And I think what's missing is the reality, which is the bodies of children being pulled from the rubble, their dreams deferred, destroyed. And even when the media tends to report on these things, and I hate to use the term humanizing Palestinians, because why should they have to be humanized? They are in fact human. But of course, that's not what Israeli leaders and many Western leaders parrot and peddle, which is this idea that they're human animals and there's no such thing as a civilian. I mean, these are direct quotes that have come from the mouths of Israeli ministers. There's been deliberate starvation used as a tool of war. There's been a siege for 20 years, and the voices of those who are surviving unimaginable horror, the mainstream media refuses to call it what it clearly is, what the ICJ said it is plausible to be just months into the genocide. And instead they lean on all these sort of euphemisms, and they do all this mental and linguistic gymnastics like conflict, or even calling it a war, when in reality we're witnessing an advanced stage of a colonial project, and it's very asymmetric. So I think the framing is key. And this idea that Israel has a right to defend itself. No country really has a right to defend itself, or that it is even defending itself rather than being the aggressor as an occupier. I mean, international law is clear about that. I'm not a legal expert, but not only do they do that, but they ignore the Palestinian right to defend themselves, to resist an illegal occupation that has suffocated them for decades.
I mean, I find that point, for the occupier to not have the right to defend themselves, so personal as a Pakistani and as a Mauritian background person. I mean, how on earth could the subcontinent have become free from British rule had they not fought back, had they not retaliated, had they not burnt down things and set people, killed people and fought back? It just wouldn't have happened. The British Empire in India just wouldn't have happened. And any colony for that matter, that was brutally besieged and controlled for so long. So I find the hypocrisy there just shocking. Yeah. But just in terms of your point, in terms of the reframing and purposely dehumanizing, one of the things that always comes back to me is, the very famous, to give a name, is Hind Rajab, right? And how they identified a child, calling her a young lady, quote unquote, and she's just one example, but it's the example where we have a recording of her pleading for her life, repeatedly, whilst in a car with her family, and yet even that is excused.
Yeah, it's not excused. It would be one thing if it was to be excused. What's really worse is that it's justified. I mean, what's happening is the indefensible is being justified, right? In the case of Hind, for example, with the documented evidence, it's not just Hind, sadly. Every day for the last 17 months, we've seen the documentation of perverse, obscene crimes. We've seen Israeli soldiers document their own crimes and proudly boast about having committed them.
On Instagram,
on Twitter, on X,
all over social media,
on TikTok, and that just goes to show what the decades of impunity that has been afforded to or granted to Israel by the West. I mean, in the narrative of Western media, not only is there no genocide, there is this self-defense war, that started only on October 7th. Each time there is a war for the past 75 years, where starvation and mass murder and even rape is justified. And, it's not just the Israeli leaders. I mean, what's really alarming is recently there was a public policy poll in Israel. I'll cut to the chase. 20% of the Israeli citizens are Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship. Those 20% were against Trump's takeover plan or plan to ethnically cleanse Gaza and occupy it himself, I guess. 97% of Jewish Israelis were for the plan. And that only 3% of Israelis were against the ethnic cleansing, which, by the way, is a declaration of not only just violation of international law, but a really heinous, obscene crime, right? And so, I guess the one thing I will say is, to end this point is, You've seen it, Saqib. Palestinians die while Israelis are killed or butchered. And
Yeah.
the terminology, language matters not just in media, but terms like massacre and slaughter are only ever used by the New York Times to describe the killing of Israelis, never for the killing of Palestinians. And yet, look at the disproportionate death toll of children, of women. Israelis target women. 75% of those who have been killed during this genocide are women and children. And that's intentional because the goal is to eliminate future generations, to eliminate the people from the land. And, the BBC in a 4-week period, for your audience who don't know this, early on, this is in the first few months of the World War, there was a study done. And let's just say journalists in the BBC on air, online, used TV journalists specifically used the term murder, murderous, mass murder, brutal murder, and merciless murder 52 times to refer to Israelis who'd been killed on October 7th. But they didn't use it once, not once, on TV for Palestinian deaths, even now that we know there have been over 60, 70,000 deaths. So, I mean, that should tell you all you need to know, right?
So with that point then, how is it for you personally seeing your fellow journalists around the world being so unapologetically biased and in many cases just spreading dis and misinformation?
I mean, I don't know what to say about this part. I've done a lot to try to correct this dereliction of duty, to put it kindly. And I think what's much more accurate would be the fact that so much of media is now propaganda. It's the peddling of propaganda masked as information. And it's, very, very acutely obvious with Israel and Palestine coverage. But it's a broader problem, sadly, and that's why I think we see so little trust in media and institutions in general in the West. But yeah, I mean, I think there are individual journalists and independent media outlets that are doing, kind of a good job, and they're new. Some of them are. Say it again.
Would you name any independent?
Yeah, I mean, look, I've worked. I think it's undeniable that Al Jazeera English, because they have reporters on the ground. Of course, now they've been banned not just by Israel, but by the Palestinian Authority from the West Bank and from Israel. But they've been doing incredible reporting at great risk. There are also outlets like Mondo Vice, like Plus 972 Magazine, Electronic Intifada, also Dropsite News, Democracy Now!, The Intercept, Zeteo. I mean, these are truly independent outlets that are doing some incredible investigative reporting and providing, I hate to call it counter narratives, but let's just say counter narratives to the propaganda that is being disseminated. And, let's not forget that propaganda is very well funded, well coordinated. And we know how big the Zionist and Israeli lobby, how big a role it plays in the US and how long it's played a role. It's very obvious. We saw that for anyone who's been covering the election in the US this past year, but it's also true in Germany. It's also true across Europe. Yeah, and I think, fairness is rare, sadly, in mainstream Western media because objectivity, something, I studied at Columbia as a student and then went on to teach there for several years, but I always knew that there was no such thing as objectivity. I mean, I think there's something about being fair, being true to the facts, providing context, being balanced. Those are achievable aspirations, and they're important. But objectivity is often just a guise or a smokescreen for complicity in injustice. When media institutions rely on access to Israeli officials or corporate interests tied to arms sales and the military-industrial complex, or on narratives that are shaped by Western governments, they're structurally incapable of fairness.
It's interesting you use the word context and giving context as part of any reporting. I remember seeing, I can't remember which channel it was on, but it was an interview with a British journalist. I think it might have been on the BBC, to be fair, with a Israeli official. And I remember the journalist trying to give a context and the Israeli official saying to them, don't you dare try to contextualize this?
How could you dare? Yeah, I know exactly what you're
I
talking about.
can't
And the fact
remember who it was
yeah,
off my head right now.
I think it might have been the former Israeli defense minister. Anyhow, yeah.
Hmm.
Don't you, it was like, how dare you ask me this question? It was about, I think, are you talking about the one about the innocent Palestinians and because it was like, how dare you? Anyway, yeah. There's been so many instances like that.
Exactly.
So yeah.
I think it's not the first time, and it certainly won't be the last time. So just moving on though.
Yeah.
One of the reasons I guess we got you on onto Fighting Fear's Queer Talk podcast was also to talk about Palestinian people generally, but
Sure.
also one of the sub communities within that would be the queer Palestinian people.
Sure.
So I guess when we think about queer Palestinian people, we often think about them experiencing, multiple erasure in various directions. What does that layered oppression feel like on a daily basis for queer Palestinians? If you could shed some light on that.
Yeah, I've spoken to several, and I guess for me, I think what would be helpful for your audience in terms of shedding light on that, I would hate to talk in that capacity because I don't live there. I never grew up there. But that said, I do want to just flag something, if I may. There's a Palestinian woman who recently won the world's largest LGBTQ plus short film award. Her name's Dima Hamdan. And this is like the Oscars of the LGBTQ short film world, if you will. And she made this incredible film called Blood Like Water, and it was just, I watched it at the Oslo Fusion Film Festival, which where the film that I was in, that we'll talk about, I guess, in a second, was also there. And she won that film festival as well. And I just share that with your audience because I think that film itself, even though it's a short and it's not all encompassing, it really is a very powerful depiction of the reality that you're asking me about, of what it's like to be sort of erased for your Palestinian identity, but then also erased by your queer identity. I guess all I can say is I think the rhetoric has gotten so absurd that even Israeli late night comedy is cashing in on all this. Like, there was an Israeli sketch comedy show that put out a skit that went viral, and the punchline was like a couple of queer pro-Palestinian activists that were portrayed as clueless, sort of rainbow flag waving puppets cheering for LGBTQ rights. But then they added the letter H, which of course stands for Hamas, as if that's like some clever thing. And, so it's like, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I think, homophobia does exist in Palestinian society, in Arab society, in a lot of Muslim societies.
Yeah.
No one's denying that. And it's been outlawed, for a long time, and they do face real threats, right? Whether you're queer or trans, you face threats not only from conservative elements in your own communities in Palestine, but also more primarily from the violence of the occupation itself. And so, when people, I don't know, I guess the reality of what it's like to be queer anywhere, including in America today, despite the different sort of cultural norms and advances that have been made over time, I think it's, being different in any capacity, whether it's sexuality or what have you, if it's just gender, right? Which is
I
obviously
think
different
being
than
a woman in America currently is dangerous, to be fair.
Yeah, I mean, look, being black in America is dangerous. Being Muslim in America is dangerous. Being Jewish in America is dangerous, in no small part because a lot of Americans are horrified and unable to distinguish, like, okay, so Israel's the Jewish state, Israel's committing genocide, Israel's doing all this violence, and they come to the natural conclusion of fuck this state. Sorry, forgive my frankness, I don't know. But, I see these sort of like identity politics battles being waged, and so that's why I don't know. It's a very convenient narrative to say, as serious a problem as homophobia is in Palestine, in Egypt, in many Arab countries, it's a very convenient narrative that is used to obfuscate and distract from, I think, what I would call a much more egregious violation of humanity, which is what the Zionist rogue state has been doing for decades to the native Palestinian people, including queer people.
With that, one of the things I think, one of the slogans, I suppose, that keeps popping its ugly racist head up time and time again, whenever there's some unrest between, when it's heightened unrest, shall we say, between Israelis and the Palestinians, is this phrase, I'm sure you've heard of it, queers for Palestine is like chickens for KFC.
Yeah, I've heard of it. I know that Netanyahu has used this phrase, and I think that should tell you how discredited that phrase is. I mean, he's a war criminal that's been indicted by the ICC, so I don't know. There's an arrest warrant out for him, and so I wouldn't give too much time or energy into trying to deconstruct this phrase that is so manipulative and so offensive, not just to Palestinians or queer people, but also to chickens. What I would say is this, international queer solidarity with Palestine is not new, Saqib. It didn't start with social media activism or on TikTok or on protests at Columbia University, my alma mater. I think LGBTQ plus Palestinians have been fighting for their rights, both as queer people and as Palestinians, for decades. And there's a long history of queer movements standing with Palestine. In fact, recently I was in Athens just with, in the summer, and I stumbled upon the Pride celebrations in Athens. I actually hadn't intended to go, and then a friend of mine was like, you should come. And I was like, why? He's like, because they're doing such a huge Palestinian manifestation at the Pride, and it was so powerful to witness and just see connections being made. I mean, within Palestine itself, the queer movement has really been growing, believe it or not, since the early 2000s. But now, because of the sheer horror of what Israel has been doing in Gaza and how they're getting away with it and all the impunity, I think you're starting to see, the reason Netanyahu and others use this phrase is, again, to obfuscate and to sort of, it's like when people say to me when I criticize the Israeli government, oh, you go to Gaza and see how they're going to treat you, because maybe I'm not, they perceive me, it's just a deflection, honestly. I mean, there's this dangerous narrative, this idea that Palestinian society is uniquely homophobic, or that homophobia or violence or hatred or intolerance is somehow baked into Palestinian culture. And what this framing does is it completely ignores the broader reality of occupation of a brutal military system that crushes any kind of social progress, whether it's women, whether it's gender, whether it's sexuality. I mean, when people are denied basic freedoms, when you're under siege, you're under surveillance, you don't have freedom of movement, you're under constant military control, guess what? That pressure fuels all kinds of societal problems and limitations, including homophobia. And that's also intentional. And then where I think it gets really insidious, if I may, some argue that because there's homophobia in Palestinian society, the fight against Israel's apartheid policies, the fight for Palestinian liberation should somehow take a back seat, right? And I mean, that's not just like a flawed argument, it's also obscenely racist. It erases queer Palestinians entirely. It pretends they don't exist, or worse, that they're part of the fight for their own freedom. I mean, it ignores the fact that there is a history of activism inside Palestine. And I don't know if you're familiar with Mark Lamont Hill. He's a friend of mine, and I used to work with him at HuffPost. He has a show on Al Jazeera. And he wrote this book called Except for Palestine, The Limits of Progressive Politics, right? And over and over.
Actually, I just finished reading the book.
Are you serious?
Well, I was like, I know this name. Why do I know this name? But it's just because I'm terrible with names. It's
same.
Eye-opening, the literal mental gymnastics that take place when it comes to being a progressive. It's the whole PEP, isn't it? Progressive Except for Palestine.
Exactly. That's it. And, over and over, we see this in progressive spaces that are willing to speak up on every issue, literally every issue except Palestine,
Mm.
right? And Palestinian rights
Yeah.
specifically. Forget the country, but, forget for a second, like the right to a land that we once had that was taken away from us by colonization and land theft and continues to be. No, just the basic human rights of Palestinian beings, human beings. And of course, as you know, and I think, that's what you were asking about in your initial question, the tool that's used to justify this exceptionalism is pinkwashing,
Mm.
which weaponizes LGBTQ rights to dehumanize Palestinians. And it highlights, again, the pinkwashing weaponizes the rights of queer people in order to dehumanize Palestinians. So, it highlights homophobia in Palestinian society, but then again ignores all the systemic destruction and violence and oppression that they face. And, it paints Palestinians as inherently backwards, which couldn't be further from the truth in terms of like reality and statistics, making it easier to sort of justify their suffering. And this is how, sadly, the conversation gets so twisted, where, Palestinians are only talked about as perpetrators of violence or as people somehow responsible for their own suppression, oppression, and collective punishment. But the truth is, for those who are, hearing all this and like disillusioned, the fight for queer liberation and the fight against imperialism, and in so doing, the fight for Palestinian, dignity and freedom, are not separate struggles. In fact, they are so deeply connected. And that's where, say it again.
For sure, I was just going to say, one of the things I often say whenever I'm giving a training or I'm speaking in any social teaching context, is that, if you want to understand how people function, just see how they treat women, and then everything is a subset of that. If they treat their women bad, but they can obviously treat queer people bad. They're going to obviously treat BIPOC bad, and so on and so forth. Everything just a subsect of that treatment of women.
And queer Palestinians, just to end the loop that we were discussing, I mean, I think they're living proof of this. You can't ask someone to choose, to answer your original question, between their queer identity and their Palestinian identity. I mean, the queer Palestinians that I know who live in the West or live in the East or live in Palestine, whether they're occupied or not, I mean, they don't exist in separate worlds as an individual. They are intertwined and inextricable. And so I think to act otherwise, which is what the KFC thing you asked me about, or pinkwashing, insists on, is prioritizing one over the other. And I think that completely misinterprets, misunderstands, and sort of misrepresents the reality of both struggles.
For sure. Just with that, I'm also conscious that you recently did a movie. I say recently, I recently saw it. I don't know how long ago you did it.
Yeah.
You were in a short movie called "The Men I Met." All the men I met but never dated.
Correct.
Loved it. Firstly, I did not know you were an actor, so that was a very pleasant surprise. I didn't know that was something that you were into, but it was great to see you in that. And for anyone who wants to watch it, I highly recommend watching it.
Appreciate that.
But one of the things you highlight in that is this intersectional identity of being a Muslim and being a queer person. And, one of the things that at least I felt it highlighted was the concept of the closet as both a refuge, but also a source of isolation. And I guess this is what you're talking about when you're talking about queer Palestinians, and getting them to choose one or the other, right? And I think often in the West, this is where the conversation is often missed. Like, oh, you're in the closet, so you must be suffering, rather than actually seeing some of the benefits of being in the closet, some of the safety that comes with being in the closet can give you, the things that it protects you from. And, I don't just mean physical protection. I also mean financial protection. I mean housing, for God's sake. Homophobia is a real issue, irrespective of where we are in the world. So firstly, how did you get into acting? But also, how did you feel to do that role?
Go ahead.
as a Palestinian yourself, how did you
Yeah.
feel in that role?
No, it's a great question. I got into acting when I was 10. And then I got out of acting in my 20s when I was like, trying to prove to the world that I'm, have value and this and that. And there were many reasons why I sort of had a departure and then a career in journalism for 20 years. But to me, a lot of journalism is a sort of performance art as well, especially in TV in the capacity that I used to host TV shows and stuff like that, talk shows and, the like. But I've recently, in the last few years, I'd say 5 years, been doing a lot of short films. And I think that filmmaking is so much more profoundly powerful in terms of challenging people's perceptions and the status quo than journalism, unfortunately. Or maybe fortunately. I mean, I have films that I watched when I was much younger, like A Time to Kill and so many others, The Shawshank Redemption,
Hmm.
that involve themes of justice and whatnot, social justice. And to this day, like I think about them and they inform sort of how I live my life. And that's
Hmm.
the power of film, right? Not to mention the embellishment you can have in film. I got involved in this film because, I've been, looking at scripts, doing auditions, and the director, Munib, reached out to me and, he sent me a few scripts. There's one script he had sent me about sort of a queer Arab who's a caretaker of a black elderly man. And I actually thought that script was a lot more hard-hitting, if I'm going to be honest. Munib might watch this and be disappointed. But the truth is, both scripts were great. This particular script, All the Men I Dated, I always get it mixed up. All the Men I Met but never dated. It was a bit not one-dimensional, but it was a bit. It's like a slice of life. Like I feel like it's a script that could be part of a much bigger story, right? But what made me so intrigued was exactly what you were describing, right? It's like we have all these expectations of what liberation and what justice is, what freedom is, what human dignity means, and that if you're queer or if you're a woman, that freedom means not wearing a hijab. If you're queer, freedom means being out of the closet.
Hmm.
But really what freedom means is the freedom to be you as you choose to be within the context of your life. And what I loved about this particular story is that it challenged, I think, many people from many different backgrounds, right? Like whether you're white or Western or, queer or straight or Muslim or Arab or Pakistani or Palestinian or what have you. It really challenged and encouraged you to confront your own notions of what it means to be free. I mean, for me, the concept of sort of, how can I put it, the closet, right? Because, we're talking right now about queerness, but, there's a lot of different type of people who live in a lot of different types of closets, right? And for me, the concept of the closet, whether in terms of identity, belief, or societal expectations, is inherently layered. It offers protection, a space where one can process and define themselves, where one can embark on that journey at their own pace. But it also can be very much so a prison shaped by external pressures, right? And so the film, in a way, and the reason what I tried to do in acting this character was really approach and experience this duality. I mean, trying to lean into the tension between comfort and constraint. I wanted to embody that internal dialogue that so many of us can relate to, the moment of relief and solitude contrasted with the weight of self-censorship. At the same time, I tried to reflect how the closet can feel like both a sanctuary and a suffocation at the same time. And, this film, because it's a short film, is kind of straightforward. But, in any film, even when the lines might not be there, you always want to try to imagine what that character endures outside of the realities and parameters of the script and bring that sort of emotion into your being. And that's something that I think, I hope it resonated with you, but I hope it resonates with more people, because sometimes staying in the closet, as you said, in this context of being queer, as a Muslim, as a Pakistani, but also as a Christian in Kansas, also, so it's like
grace.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I think I, in my own personal life, have met a lot of people who, because of circumstances, because of familial issues, but sometimes just because of the need to like not be kicked out of their home, whether in Puerto Rico, Kansas, Palestine, Pakistan, um, it's an ongoing struggle. And I think this idea that there's a very simple solution, which is just come out of the closet, which is what the love interest of my character Ali wanted him to do. Yeah, I think it's a great film, and there were a lot of people in my life who were like, you shouldn't do this film for all these reasons, but sometimes you just got to trust your gut.
My favorite, I mean, I love the thing, the whole thing. My favorite and the most powerful part for me was actually really the end, where you
The
see,
dancing?
yeah, because of how that sits within the movie, that you don't know how to dance, or the assumption that you can't dance and you don't know
Yeah.
how you're too stiff, whatever the implications were made, and then you see you dancing and the freedom by
Yeah,
which.
and now we've spoiled it for everyone now,
Oh,
but
sorry.
no, I'm joking. It's
Oh,
fine. It's
yes.
fine. I said dance. You know what it was about that? And that was kind of not really planned in the first version of the script, but any film evolves. If I'm not mistaken, actually, that wasn't in the first, but maybe it was an intention of Munib, the director. But for me, what I thought was so powerful about that is like it affirmed that just because he said he didn't know how to dance doesn't mean he didn't know how to dance. It means he didn't want to dance in that moment for whatever reason he wanted. And again, that's where it's like the personal autonomy to choose not just can you or should you, but how and when to express yourself.
Exactly.
I thought that was really,
I thought it was
I mean,
incredible.
also there was no choreography. So he's like, yeah, can you just dance like a Pakistani? And I was like, do you have someone who can teach me? And he was like, you don't watch movies? Like you don't watch Bollywood? You don't watch this? And I was like, dude. But so I kind of tried to incorporate all forms of dance into it. Was very impromptu, which is also all the more liberating. So maybe all the more symbolic.
Well, thank you so much for your time. We'll wrap this up for today. So really, once again, thank you for taking your time to do this. So this is Queer Talk. Queer Talk is a podcast by Fighting Fear. Fighting Fear is a community for queer people by queer people. You can find out more about us on our website, www.fightingfear.co.uk, and our social media handles, Fighting Fear Community, on all major social media platforms. Once again, thank you so much, Ahmed. It's been a pleasure to have you.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.